Hello everyone, and welcome to tonight's Festival of Debate event. My name is Joe and I'm from the not-for-profit social enterprise Opus Independence that coordinates the Festival of Debate. The festival is an annual programme that takes place here in Sheffield to bring communities together to discuss new ideas that shape our understanding of the world. Now, all Festival of Debate events are pay what you feel, but we do rely on donations from the audience members to help us make it happen. If you can donate to help support the Festival of Debate, that would be much appreciated. And you can do so by clicking on the PayPal link, which we'll share in the chat, or by visiting www.festivalofdebate.com. That's it for me. I'll be running the live stream in the background, but now I'm very happy to introduce our chair for tonight's event. Please welcome Shania.
Hi everyone, thank you so much, Joe, and thank you everyone for being here with us tonight. My name's Shania Ives and I'm the co-founder of Adoptee Futures. My co-host for tonight is Annalisa. She is also the co-founder of Adoptee Futures, so I'll pass over to her.
Hi, so lovely to have you all here. I'm really excited about tonight's event. Adoptee Futures is an organisation created by myself and Shania. We're both adult adoptees with a range of experiences. We first met on Adoptee Twitter through the Adoptee community, and really we got to know each other over the last sort of year during lockdown. We've been engaging in adoption and non-adoption related discussion on Twitter, and of course Clubhouse, and so our conversations over the last year have made us realise that there's such a massive lack of support for adult adoptees in the UK. And to be quite honest, we were outraged that most of the adoption charities in the UK have very little support for adult adoptees, and that they tend to be sort of a final thought in their services. So both of us kind of came up with the idea of Adoptee Futures, and here we are. We'll be explaining a bit more about the work that we are doing during the event. Both of us believe that healing from adoption starts with understanding, and that this understanding has to be trauma informed, and that it is a journey that happens throughout our whole lives. There will be a time for an audience Q&A, so you can pop your questions in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please do send us questions, but what I do ask is that we're all mindful about what we say and post in the chat conversation, because talking about adoption can be a delicate topic for all. The internet is not a safe space, and this isn't a place for trauma dumping. I'm going to pass across to Shania, who will be hosting the rest of the event.
Thank you so much, Annalisa. So I'm going to start by introducing myself, who I am, and then I'll let Annalisa introduce herself, and then we'll go to our amazing panelists. So my name is Shania Ives. I'm an adult adoptee. I was adopted at the age of 4. I was fostered before that. I was fostered by the people who adopted me, my mum and dad. I moved to France. I grew up in France, and then I came back to England to study. I'm currently studying clinical psychology, and I'm aiming to become a clinical psychologist and help adopted adults have therapy, have trauma-informed therapy, and heal through what they've gone through. I'll pass over to you, Annalisa, to introduce yourself.
So yeah, I am adopted. Adoption's always been sort of a part of me. It's something that I've always kind of spoken about, but really only in the house, because I've always been told that I shouldn't talk about my adoption. So for me, this is a really awesome event, and also a brilliant space that we can have these conversations. A lot of my work is centered around racial identity, anti-racism, sustainable change, and development trauma. And yeah, very excited about this and what we're going to hear next. Back to you, Shania.
Thank you so much, Annalisa. Okay, so we're going to introduce you guys to our amazing panelists. Okay, guys, if you could turn on your cameras. Angela, if we could go to you first, could you introduce yourself and tell everyone what your link to adoption is?
Yes. Hi, thanks, Shania. I'm Angela Fraser-Wicks, and I am what's known within the system as a birth mum. My eldest two children were adopted back in 2004, predominantly down to domestic violence and mental health issues. I have a 9-year-old little girl who has no local authority involvement at all. And shortly before Christmas, I was reunited with my eldest son, who's now 22. So that's my link to adoption.
Thank you so much, Angela. Okay, Sarah, if we go to you.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm adoptee, but I grew up in care. So up until the age of 9, I went through the care system. I went in children's homes, foster homes, potential adoptees. But my adoption wasn't a positive experience. I left home when I was 17, got married, had kids. But my adoption and my childhood is what's made me who I am today. I feel that it is part of me, but the trauma is always there, but I strive to make it a positive thing from negativity.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Pam, can we go to you?
Hello, everyone. I'm Pam Hodgkins. I was a 1950s adoptee when, of course, adoption was a very different scenario to the ones that people are experiencing today and have experienced since about the 1980s onwards. In 1981, I traced my birth mother and realised that it was rather a more complex issue than a questionnaire of medical information that I was hoping to achieve. As a result of that, I tried to find support organisations, learned there wasn't any, and the consequence of that was that NORCAP came into existence, which became the National Support Organisation for adults affected by adoption, until sadly the climate of austerity forced its close in 2013, by which time I'd retired and disappeared to Canada. Having recently come back to the UK, I am quite shocked and disturbed by the terrible lack of services for adults affected by adoption, and have tried to begin working in the background to see if that can't be remedied.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you. Okay, before we go to Dawn, I'd just like to mention, if you do want to tweet along with this webinar, if you could include the hashtag AdopteeFutures, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Okay, Dawn, I'm going to pass over to you.
Great, thank you. So I'm Dawn. I am an adult adoptee. I currently do a lot of work with adoption agencies to improve and reform training offered to potential adopters. And I'm also training to be a social worker. So, yeah.
Thank you, Dawn. Okay, I'm going to pass over to you, David.
Hi, everyone. My name's David. I am a social worker. At the moment, I am director of an adult social care provider organisation, focusing particularly on the African Caribbean community. Prior to that, I worked in Sheffield as a senior manager for many years, and part of my remit was chair of the adoption panel. I'm old enough to have been around when work was going on around the same race placement policy, and also when the Cameron government began to really push adoption as the option for children in the looked after system. And so that's my link to adoption, and always had hesitancy about adoption being the option as opposed to an option.
Thank you so much, David. Okay, I'm going to pass over to Tracy.
Good evening all. My name is Tracy Ogleton and I'm a consultant social worker for one of the regionalised adoption agencies. Been a social worker for the last 30 years and specialising in adoption support for the last 20 years. Yeah, that's me.
Thank you, Tracy. Okay, Scott, I'm going to pass over to you.
Thanks, Shania. Hi, everybody. I'm Scott Caston-Rennie. I'm a same-sex couple who've adopted 3 children over the years since 2007. They were adopted at the age, the first 2 were adopted at the age of 7 and 8, and they're now 22 and 21. And secondly, we adopted another 7-year-old who's now 14, nearly 15. My experience really then resulted in me working in the charity sector for Adoption UK, supporting adoptive parents for 5 years, and now I'm kind of independent of that. I co-host the Adoption and Fostering podcast, but I also still support parents and do training, and really, trying to kind of change the narrative, which is the point of this whole event, really, to make sure that we include all the voices involved in adoption.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Scott. Okay, Kimberly, I'm going to pass over to you.
Thanks. Hi everyone, I'm Kimberly. My link to adoption is I was adopted when I was about 2 months old in Jamaica, and then we moved over to London when I was 6. So yeah, that's my link. This is all very new to me. In fact, I think it wasn't until last year some of the people that I'm closest with, they didn't know I was adopted. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Okay, thank you. And thanks to all our panelists for introducing themselves. So I think that the major narrative in adoption is that it's a beautiful thing. However, many of us who are closely involved with adoption talk about it being a traumatic experience. We talk about it being trauma. And we also talk about adverse experiences in childhood being linked to poor mental health in adulthood. So Tracy, if I could go to you, could you explain to us the impact adoption has on a child and what this can result in?
Yeah, yeah. As you mentioned, Shania, regarding children experiencing trauma, regardless of how positive their adoption experiences was, just the mere fact of children being removed from their birth family, they've already experienced relational trauma. And then adding to that the different various adverse childhood experiences that they may have experienced. When I'm talking about childhood experience, I'm talking about things like physical abuse, emotional neglect or neglect in general, difficulties with parents with mental health difficulties, parents who have got drug or alcohol, substance misuse, and the impact in terms of their parenting that may have on the child. So right from the onset, children are experiencing developmental or relational trauma. And what we've seen, both in my professional capacity, but also with regards to what research has shown, is that majority of adopted children experiences of trauma or abuse manifests itself in very significant and difficult emotional regulation, and that can manifest itself in very challenging behaviours, whether it's issues with aggression, eating disorders, anything with regards to their learning and ability to engage in education because of their preoccupation with their adoption experiences. And what we have seen is that those issues, regardless of parents maybe accessing therapeutic services, that some of those difficulties then continue to manifest in their behaviours, in their experiences as adults as well. So yeah, it has a significant impact on children and their mental health well-being.
Thank you, Tracy. Yeah, I think that this is something that many people don't know. I'd like to go to you, David, if you'd like to add anything to this.
Yeah, I'd just like to I endorse a lot of what Tracy has said, but I guess for me, the only thing I would add is that adoption was marketed, if you like, as a risk-free strategy for looked after children who, for whatever reason, were removed from their family. And my contention always was it's not a risk-free option, and that as children age and move into adolescence, as with all adolescents being a raging ball of hormones and all the rest of it, questions are asked, and then they are overlaid by the fact that there's often a disconnect with who they are and understanding where they've come from. And I feel that social work in many regards didn't sufficiently acknowledge that element of the adoption process, and it was just about getting children out of the looked after system. And I think particularly for children of colour, it became very much a political football, which didn't serve anybody well.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. Pam, I'd love to know your thoughts on this.
Yes, I agree that the basic thing is that adoption arises from loss. You can't get away from loss in adoption, because inevitably for the child there is the loss of the birth parents, and for the birth parents there is the loss of their child. And however much that is wrapped up, and particularly during the 50s, 60s and 70s, as we've been hearing on news programs in the last 24 hours, it was a process that was expected. It was doing the right thing. It was even said to be doing the best for your baby. It was considered by parents of unmarried mothers that they were doing the best for their daughter by ensuring her child was adopted, because they presumed that gave her a fresh start. None of us actually have fresh starts, because we are today the sum of everything that has happened to us up until today. I think the impact of the loss will materialize in every child in a different way. There's no set pattern. You can't say that because someone has been adopted, they are going to experience X amount of trauma. Everyone has different levels of resilience. Everyone will have different levels of different experiences later in life, which may compound that loss, or they may be experiences which alleviate it. I would consider myself to have been extremely fortunate in having adoptive parents who were extremely inclusive and open years before anyone was suggesting that was what adoptive parents should be, who didn't see that my birth family was anyone to exclude from my life, right down to a little tiny girl saying her prayers of God bless mummy, daddy and Mary wherever she is. And I think those experiences probably made my adoption and my trauma that much less than many people of my generation did experience. And of course, children more latterly adopted who have been removed into public care have other traumas as well to compound with the basic loss of adoption.
Thank you so much for your thoughts, Pam. You spoke about adoption originating from loss. I'd like to extend this question to the adoptees on the panel. So what are your thoughts about adoption being loss and adoption being trauma? Should we go to you? Yeah, Sarah.
Yeah, obviously I went into care when I was 6 weeks old. My birth birth parents were in a mother and baby unit, so it was very early on. The foster home, although to me it was normal, it was like family, I wasn't actually told that I was in care until I were about 5. But from my understanding, I took it as a matter of fact that, oh, I've just got somebody else somewhere else. Then moved on to, because there was a separation between them, moved into a children's home. Again, quite a nice place. Then I moved into a potential adoption family. I had actually up until that point been with my twin sister, so we grew up most of our life together. We were exhibiting behaviour that showed that we'd been abused quite badly by our foster dad, but we just thought it was normal behaviour. So from that, we were told that they couldn't cope with the abuse or the allegation. We weren't given any support. We were moved on into a children's home. Thinking back, it was probably quite neglectful. There was no love as such. You had somebody there. Then we were moved on again to the family that was going to adopt us. Within 3 months, they decided that they couldn't support my twin sister, who's got learning disability, as they could do. So we weren't included in any decisions. We were just separated. It was a case of, you woke up one morning, you're not going to live together anymore. That's it. We're moving, you're separated. So that in itself, again, was trauma. We'd moved on, as I'd stayed at the home where I was adopted. They didn't have the abilities to look after a child. It was very much, to solve any issue, you need to hurt the child. A lot of abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse. I was adopted when I was 10. But again, I was brought up with this almost illusion that adoption is the be all and end all for me. I left when I was 17. I walked out. I didn't look back. It has all been very traumatic, but in all that time that I was going through all that traumatic experience, there were positives. Brushing somebody's hair, it's not much, but it is. It's that sense of purpose, having those influences in life that have that positive thing. I know I've spoken to different people in the past saying, well, you're not on drugs, you're not on alcohol. Yeah, you have some depression, and part of your thing is you overeat sometimes. In all, I think I've taken that and turned it into a positive for the sake of my children. But even with that, it's when I have my children, is someone going to take my children away from me? Is someone watching me? Is someone going to make sure that I'm taking care of my children? Our oldest is 21 now, so youngest is 11. So it's changed from that, and I think there has been a lot of loss, a lot of trauma, but it's part of me, it's part of my story, and it's made me who I am today. It's made me the positive person. So without the trauma, I wouldn't be the person I am today.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Sarah. Okay, so I'd like to go to the other adoptees. If you could briefly give your thoughts on adoption being trauma and the loss that is connected to that. Okay, if I could go to you, Dawn.
Yeah, so I would say that obviously adoption doesn't sit as an independent act. When you're adopting someone, you're adopting a person, they have history. And just from the fact that when you're adopted, you don't have a birth certificate, you have an adoption certificate, you can see that there's a loss because you have to relinquish something to move on into a new family, a new situation. I think as well, people consider adoption and loss as just losing your birth family or your birth parents, but it's wider than that. You can lose siblings, you can lose aunts, uncles, cousins, you lose school friends, people that you've got to know, and then maybe you're in a foster placement or a care home, and then you're moved on again. So you go through multiple layers of loss. It's not just one relationship or one person. And just personally, the loss for me, I lost my first family. I was adopted when I was 4. I lost my first family, but it was seen as something shameful to be considered lost because I came from a really negative background. So I shouldn't have experienced that. Like, people wouldn't understand why I was upset or why I would want to know those people. So I guess I struggle to get like external validation that it's okay to feel that loss. So I think you can definitely see that it's rooted in loss. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Dawn. Kim, if we can go to you.
Yeah, for me, I was thinking it is loss from the beginning, and then in your day-to-day life, you're kind of reminded of the loss. So I feel like there might be triggers that happen in life. So personally for me, one is that I don't know why I was adopted, or I don't know what happened to my birth family. But something for me is not looking like anyone. So then every day I'm reminded of the loss, because there'll be a trigger where I'll see people or families that look like each other, and then I think, oh, I don't know who I look like. So that, I think, being adopted, you can be reminded of the loss a lot as well, which is trauma again in itself.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I definitely agree with everything that you're saying. Angela, if we could go to you, you've told us that you're a birth parent. So what are your thoughts on this and how does this affect you?
Oh, I agree. I've been furiously scribbling notes down when everybody else is talking, because I can relate to everything everybody said. I mean, obviously, from the perspective of a birth parent, I don't think there's a greater trauma or a greater loss than being made to say goodbye to your own child. And when my son left, he was 5. And we had a very close bond. And so that, to me, I was very aware of that it was a loss for him as well. And that he was, and, as everybody else has touched upon, he wasn't just separated from me, who up until that point had been his primary caregiver. He was also separated from his foster carers, from his friends, from his teachers, and sort of picked up from one place and put into a new place, and expected to be able to continue as if nothing had happened. And the whole while this being said that this was in his best interests, that the risk of him staying with me was greater than him having to go through this enormous turmoil and this enormous life change. And nobody really trying to understand what that was going to do to a 5-year-old little boy who suddenly had to forget about one mum and start to love a new mum. And that transition and what that must have been like for him, it kept me awake for a very long time, worrying about how he'd settled and was he okay. And for me, I think the bit that helped was the fact that we managed to get letterbox contact, and I was able to see that he'd settled. But more importantly as well, he was able to see that I was okay, because when he left, I was living in a refuge, and he was acutely aware that I'd been in danger, and he was worried about my safety. So for him, he had that worry on top of the loss as well. And he genuinely didn't understand, and I didn't at the time either, why we were being forced to separate, why we weren't allowed to continue to see one another. And I think as well, one thing when we're talking about loss is that the grief that you experience as a birth parent is unlike any other. You are grieving for a child that is still alive, but it's a grief that you're not able to talk about, you're not able to share with anyone, because in order to do that, you have to tell people that social work has permanently removed your child. And the majority of people in society then jump to the assumption and conclusion that you must have done something horrific. You must be guilty of abuse, of really serious neglect. They don't understand that we are regularly removing children from victims of domestic violence because we don't see another option. So you then have to go through all of that explanation just to be able to say to someone that Christmas is difficult, that Easter is difficult, that birthdays, anniversaries, everything is, you're reliving that trauma. It doesn't stop at the point of saying goodbye. It continues year on year and year. And I think it's in such a crucial role that birth family and adoptive family connect and can work together to support the child, because if those anniversaries are difficult as a parent, it follows that they must be difficult as a child. And I think it's hugely important that we start to see adoption as loss and traumatizing, and not, unfortunately, like it seems to be talked about a lot, of this happily ever after, this magical solution to a very complex problem. So I'm really pleased that we're raising that today as an issue.
Thank you so much for sharing, Angela. Scott, as an adoptive parent, I can imagine that you've had to handle the motions that your children go through regarding loss. How have you dealt with that?
Well, first of all, just hearing everybody's experiences is just kind of, making it valid what I'm about to say, because when you're going through the adoption process and you're looking to become an adoptive parent, you go through the preparation course and you're informed about this thing called loss. And the kind of view, bear in mind, I'm talking 2007 and then 2014 when we went through it. But in 2007, it was deemed the more loss you had in your life, the more you will be able to relate to your child who's placed with you for adoption. Now, I don't know about anybody else, but I've never, been in a position as a child to lose my birth parents, to lose my school, to lose my my home, all this kind of thing. So when we talk about loss, we're talking about it on a different level. When we're talking about it through adoption, it is not the same as a loss of a grandparent, or in my case, I lost my brother when he was very young. That was seen as a great advantage to being able to parent these children. That is a really bad narrative to kind of reflect on when we're thinking about adoption. Like Angela said, foster carers, other siblings, all teachers, even, people who've supported these children and these families, that's loss. We will never be able to understand that. I guess when I reflect back and think about the differences in three children and the way they've dealt with it, it's very difficult to be able to understand some of the behaviors and some of the kind of reactions to this loss. But through trying to understand is probably the best way to be able to deal with it, because it's an experience that unless you've experienced it, you'll never know. And it's about learning how to deal with it as well, and learning how to kind of cope with some of the behaviors. We all have our own issues, day-to-day issues. Some of us may have triggers through loss. Some of us may react in a way that we don't mean to, etc. But from my perspective as an adoptive parent, having that understanding, you're never going to have that experience, but having that, at least that understanding, and being able to reflect on the child's loss is probably the best place to start from when we think about how we're going to deal with it.
Thank you so much for sharing your experience, Scott. So we've spoken a lot about, I think, the narrative and how the narrative is compared to what the truth is for us who are involved in adoption. So I'd like to ask the adoptees, how do you feel that the current narrative, or do you feel that the current narrative is affecting you from healing or from living your truth? If we could go to Sarah.
I think the current narrative, it's moving forward slowly, but it's definitely not there yet. I think there is more understanding of the effects of adoptions and adoptees, and the whole care system, but it's going to be a slow process to actually get to that point where the narrative is 100% safe. I think there is still the old-fashioned that someone is going to be the saviour, that there isn't baggage, there isn't past trauma, that there isn't history behind a child or behind the family, behind obviously the adoptions. And I think once that is fully realised, it will be a lot better. I think it will improve, but it's going to take a long time.
Thank you, Sarah. So I'd like to give the same question to Pam. How do you feel like, or do you feel like the current narrative has affected your healing?
Probably not, but that's simply because of the passage of, well, over 60 years. I think the focus on loss and understanding loss is the primary thing. I also felt that everyone involved in adoption seems to have experienced quite profound loss, and definitely until the 1980s, the thing that brought most people to adoption as adoptive parents was loss. Very much, in many cases, the loss of a child either they did have that did not survive, or a child they wanted to have but were unable to have. And if you think about it, this is the only element of social care within all elements where we look to people that are very, very vulnerable themselves and effectively ask them to be the people that take care of other extremely vulnerable people, and that we have perpetuated. I'm really concerned that what brings people to the adoption situation actually almost sets them up to fail, and that is very, very sad. That perhaps whole new ways of looking at who has the capacity to care for the traumatized children and to be able to care for their birth parents and the other members of the family. We need something that is more encompassing than we have at present, and definitely more encompassing than we've had in the past.
Thank you so much, Pam, for your answer. Dawn, if we could go to you, if you could talk about the current narrative and if this has affected your healing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say I agree. I actually do think the current narrative sits a lot around the idea that adoption is beautiful. It's a happily ever after. It's seen as the end goal for looked after children, in my experience. And I think that that's really harmful to both to anyone who's been adopted, but also to anyone who's in care or who is looked after. I don't think that adoption is something anyone should be made to feel grateful for. I just don't see why it's something that you should be. Thank you for picking me. Thank you for coming to the table and wanting. No, I don't think I'm going to subscribe to that narrative. But it's quite difficult in the current climate to get that across without people say, well, what's the alternative? You went through an abusive childhood, you could still be there, or you could be in care. But I think that also paints a really negative picture of our current care climate. The adoption, which is a trauma, is seen as better than being in care. And what does that say, you know, for our UK care system, and whether it's fit for purpose, because we're making something that we can see obvious flaws in the end goal. So yeah, I think it affects people's healing. I think people who aren't adopted are made to feel less than because they haven't achieved this happily ever after. And those that are adopted who aren't happy with it or struggle with it, or even those who are happy with it and don't struggle with it, have no opportunity to say anything different or contrary without being seen as rocking the boat.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dawn. Kim, if we could go to you.
Yeah, I think the narrative is, I guess, slightly confused as well, because I know when I try and explain my situation to friends, they don't really understand it because they think, oh, you've got such a good relationship with your mum, what's there to be upset about? Or other friends would say, would you adopt because maybe you can help them with their trauma? And I just think it is, so you should be happy. Then people don't understand, and it's hard to get past that. And then if you can't explain that to people, you can't really then heal from it yourself either, or learn to heal when everyone around you thinks it's this great situation that you're in. And yeah, you kind of, I guess, feel trapped as well, to feel a certain way, and you feel you're in the wrong if you do feel, you know, negatively towards the situation. So it is very hard, and I hope we can change it, but I don't really know how we can, to kind of spread the word to so many people, but hopefully we can.
Thank you, Kim. I'd love to go to the social workers to hear your thoughts on this. So David, could we start with you?
Yeah, it's very salutary looking back and reflecting on a social work career of many, many years. I held adoption cases, I allocated adoption work, and I think we have to have the courage to have a really, really detailed conversation about adoption and what adoption is and why we do, why we still go through this process. I am not anti-adoption per se. However, I am much more pro kinship care as an option for young people, for children who, for whatever reason, have to be removed. And I think that whole thing about looking at children having been removed, being fully aware that there's a care system that is not fit for purpose, isn't always a safe alternative. And if that's the case, why are we saying that we are removing people to a place of safety? And we've got to really have this really challenging conversation about what we mean as social workers. Adoption has got to be, in my view, much more than a process of reducing the looked after children numbers. It's got to be much more about that, than being much more than that. It has to encompass the impact on the birth family network. And I think, to be absolutely candid, I think we coach it in very nice, touchy-feely terms, but there's an element of demonizing the birth family and the birth family network to justify doing this really, really intrusive, impactful thing to a child, for what may well initially seem like good reasons in the immediate term, but not having a weather eye to the long term. And so I think we are going to have a really back to basics, root and branch conversation about adoption and what it is and why we do it. And I think part of the reason why options like kinship care are not explored as much as they can be, is that real, good, strong, robust, effective kinship care is expensive. However, it's often offered in local authority alternatives as a cheaper option than a child remaining in the care system with foster carers and all the allowances. But if we're going to do this right, I think we really have to have that kind of deep, candid conversation where we allow ourselves to be vulnerable as professionals, to hear the authentic voice of those who are affected by the decisions we make.
Thank you so much, David. Tracy, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I do personally believe that and feel that there is a lack of understanding of the impact of adoption. I think not just solely with regards to professionals and all those involved in making those permanency decisions. I think in preparation of prospective adopters, because I honestly believe that if they really understood the impact of adoption, things like, for a lot of our birth families, they will engage in letterbox contact, but for a lot of our children, that isn't suffice. So when we was talking about loss, and Angela's point of, those mental times during the year of, and that preoccupation with about their birth child, that's exactly what those birth children are experiencing. And I've heard it numerous times of adopted children that I've worked with is, I don't want to be thinking about my birth family, but every single day, every time I say the word mum, if I'm in the playground and I hear if I say the word mum, or if I'm in the playground and I hear the word mum, I just naturally get brought back to the thought of my birth family. So it's with them every single day. And the thought of experiencing that loss, when we think about when we lose somebody that we love and that what that evokes, think about that 10 times over, knowing that you're experiencing those feelings, but the person is not dead. The person is still there somewhere out there. So, I think the understanding of how this impacts on a child, on a teenager, I think will change. I think, when we're preparing prospective adopters to be thinking about these open adoption, these contacts, these direct contacts, because again, sometimes for a lot of our children, a letter isn't enough. But I've seen it so many times, the difference in a child's behavior when there is direct contact, it has a significant impact on those children. And I think, the more we can, because as David said, there are those situations and there are, hundreds of children where that permanency plan of adoption is the best thing for them. But how do we do that? How are we preparing our adopters? Do they understand that you're not adopting that child, you're adopting that whole family, because the birth family is with that child every single day in that household. So I think, it is around the level of understanding and education of all those involved in making those decisions.
Thank you, Tracy. Pam, I can see that you've got your hand up. Would you like to add to this?
Yes, I would. I mean, I want to second what David said about kinship care and that concept. But it is now 30 years since Murray Ryburn brought from New Zealand the concept of family group conferences, and working with a family, putting in a great deal of impact to enable a family to work out how to best care for their children and to protect their children. And it really saddens me that in 30 years we don't seem to have got very far. And I'd also like to take up on what people have been mentioning about letterbox contact. I think letterbox contact is perhaps the saddest thing that was ever invented. I'd like to say to all my fellow professionals, when did you last write a letter that wasn't on headed paper? That is not how we communicate with people that are important to us. We communicate with those people directly. We talk to them, we message them, we can laugh with them. We don't try and put it down in a letter. If we can't be more imaginative than that, we really shouldn't be doing this at all. Let's think about how we keep in touch. The organisation that I worked for 20 years ago actually looked at new ways of contact. We called it keeping in touch. And I think we innovated some really imaginative practice at that time. And it's really sad that lack of resources is the excuse continually given for the fact that those initiatives do not get taken forward. Yet they work. They can make things better for the children, for the birth family, for the adoptive family. And they need to be given the opportunity to try it. The question we ask of prospective adopters shouldn't be, how much contact can you cope with? We should be creating a culture where contact is wanted because they can see how valuable and important it is for the children. Far more pertinent question is, do you really think you will have the capacity to parent a child where there cannot be much contact? Could you parent a child who was a foundling? Could you really parent a child whose parent has died? They're very, very challenging situations. Thankfully, most adoptive families have the opportunity to embrace the birth family as well. We as professionals must make sure that they see that as a benefit. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Pam, and thank you everyone else. I'm aware of time, so I'd like to go to Angela to get your thoughts on this, and then I'd like to speak to the adoptees on the fact that lots of our experiences are often ignored. So Angela, would you like to add in any thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Shania. And, you know, what everybody said so far resonates completely with me. I think the narrative around adoption being this happily ever after solution, and that it's only ever done as a last resort, and that everything has been done to enable that child to remain within their family. And I think that's a very dangerous narrative, and I think we all know that that's not strictly true. And like Pam was saying, this whole notion of kinship care and being seen as it's an afterthought, it's if there's no other possible solution. I mean, I found out on my wedding day, 10 years after saying goodbye to my children, that my maternal aunt would have taken my children, and she was an adopter, so she would have passed the assessment. But nobody actually bothered to contact any of my family. I was seen as the person responsible for the children, and once the decision was made that they were not going to remain with me, that was it. The solution was adoption. Nothing else was discussed. And I mean, Pam, the point around letterbox contact, I couldn't have put it better if I tried, because writing a letter to a 4-year-old is virtually impossible. How do you make that interactive? How do you make that age appropriate? How do you make that something that they're going to look forward to receiving, rather than having to rely on their adoptive parent to read it to them? There's no link there. There's no real proper family time in that letter, and that's what that letter should be. And I agree as well about the fact that we need to be looking at much better ways of doing it, and also making sure that it's fluid, that we're not, at the minute we have this one size fits all, where you will be adopted, you will send a letter, that's it. Children change, adults change, families change, and the technology that we have now has completely changed. And I think it's also as well about really adopters and birth family being told about their rights and what they are and are not entitled to. Because in my case, I had letterbox contact with my children. I went, as David, I think it was mentioned earlier, my son had some identity issues in his teens and was really struggling with letterbox. So I gave him permission to stop, to just say, look, this has to be what you want. This is not about me. And I think, again, that's another misconception, that a lot of adopters can have, is that the contact with the birth family is only for the sake of the birth family, not for the child. But I sort of backed off and said, not to worry, I'm here when you're ready. And as I mentioned earlier, I was reconnected with my son shortly before Christmas. And when we actually got to speak face to face, obviously on a screen, I discovered that he'd been attempting to contact me for 4.5 years since he turned 18, but that the local authority had just categorically said no, because his younger sibling, my younger son, was not yet 18. There was no discussion about how we could find a safe way around this. He was just told, no, she's a safeguarding risk. And in the end, he had to track me down online and go back to the local authority and say, this woman's not a safeguarding risk. And in the end, they put us in contact. But I think, again, we're seeing everything through the lens of risk. We're not thinking about love, happiness. We're not thinking about what's best for that child. And whilst in my case, the risks I know were minimal because I know me, even if they hadn't have been, there is a way around that. There is a way to manage risk and to ensure that that child still has a link with their birth family. Because as Tracy said, they don't go away. I didn't stop being my son's mum just because a piece of paper said I wasn't legally his mum. Didn't stop loving him. It doesn't change the fact that, and I find this extremely difficult to deal with when we talk to one another, it doesn't change the fact that he's inherited so much of me, his looks, his mannerisms, his personality. And he needs to be able to understand where that comes from, who he is, what happened in his past. These are questions that adopted children have a right to, and we can't just simply think that by sending them off to live with good people because we think that the birth family are bad people, that that child doesn't need that family and doesn't need that. And I say this all the time, no child has ever suffered by being told he has two mums who love him. You know, that allowing a family to express love to that child is not a risk, and it's not damaging. And it's this whole I see it at the moment about, you can adopt, but then I've seen adverts saying you don't have to be perfect to be an adopter. Yet as a birth parent, you have to be perfect. The system demands that you must have no flaws, you must make no mistakes in order to keep your child. So advertising strategies like that are hugely traumatizing, because we are seen under the spotlight. Every single thing that we do is analyzed, and for it then to say, oh well, but that doesn't matter if you want to be an adopter, it's actually really quite harmful. And I think one of the things that we must focus on is not about finding a child for the adoptive family. We must always find the right family for that child. And it mustn't, like everybody else has said, be about trying to reduce numbers of children in care. These are human beings, these are children. And we have to do, if we're saying that removing them from their birth parents is in that child's best interests, then we have to do everything in our power to make sure where we place that child is 100 times better than where they could have been, because they deserve that. Because as we've heard from the adoptees here, they will carry that with them. And the shame some people feel about having been adopted and not knowing the reasons why. We owe these children better than that. This is a care system, and I think it's about time we started to think more about putting care back into it.
Thank you so much, Angela. Scott, I can see that your hand's up.
Yeah.
Well, so I'm going to go to you, Scott, and then we had so many more questions, guys.
I'll be brief. I will be brief, promise.
Of course, yeah. So I'm going to go to you, and then yeah, thank you.
Okay, just to cut, I mean, Angela, you just said a lot of the things I wanted to say, because I was just like, but the one thing I will say is we risk assess. Oh, sorry, I don't, because I'm not a social worker, but social workers and local authorities risk assess the potential risk for a child having contact with a birth family once they're placed for adoption, and how that's going to affect the child and, the adoptive family and etc. But actually what we're not doing is we're not risk assessing the outcomes of them not having that contact. I'm not talking about letterbox contact here, because the letterbox or the contact system is just severely broken. There's been loads of research done on this. Now, I'm pleased to say that some of the regional adoption agencies are picking this up, which is fab, but not quick enough. Okay, so that would be my first thing. And secondly, can I just say that as adoptive parents, when, you know, preparation, looking back, fabulous, but there was a certain amount of fear around contact as well. Fear, and it's been mentioned, you know, birth families are made out to be this thing that potentially they're not, you know, and that's really hard when you look back now and think, well, how much of my influence on contact has been as a result of what we were told in the early stages, and how is that going to impact my children? So, you know, that would be my message in all of this, is if we're looking back and reflecting, that we need to look at those kind of the risk assessment of not having that contact with a birth family. And I'm going to leave it there.
Thank you so much, Scott, and thank you, everyone. We had so many more questions, but we don't have that much time. So I'd like to go to each of the panelists, and if you could very briefly tell us what one thing you want the audience to take away from this webinar is. If I could go to you first, Scott.
Thanks. I think if there's any prospective adopters or anybody who's in the early stages, what I'd want them to know is that I love my children dearly. I just wish that we could have had a different life with them than the one that we've had. I have learned so much since 2007, and I just wish that we had taken less, and this is not social work bashing by any means, so please nobody take it that way, but I just wish we'd had the courage to kind of come outside of what the risks that we were told would be with social workers, and also to be able to challenge social workers as well, because they're not always correct, they're not always right. I'm sorry to say, social workers, you aren't always correct. Sometimes you get it wrong. And you know, that's proven, really. You know, David's talked about kinship care there, and David, I'm assuming you're quite a kind of long-serving social worker, shall we say, and you've learned that. So actually, you know, why can we not challenge this system that we've that's been created? Yes, there's minimum standards and there's all these kinds of regulations that we have to stick to, but actually, as parents, since 2007, I would say, if you're an adoptive or you're a prospective adopter, or you're being placed with children, please have the courage to question and challenge what you potentially think might be right for that child, and continue to do that. You know, you have to do that. You spend years doing that. And yeah, that's probably the most important thing. I've got loads more I could say, but that, you know, I'm conscious everybody else needs to have their say, so I'll leave that there.
Thank you so much. Yeah, there's so much more to say. So we will be doing a Q&A after this. But Angela, if we could go to you, could you briefly tell us what you'd like the audience to take away from this webinar?
Yes, thanks, Shania. I think if there's one thing I'd like everybody to bear in mind, it's that adoption isn't the end of that child's journey. It's the beginning of a new path, and everybody who's played a part in that child's life up until that point should be given the opportunity to continue that journey with them. And we need to be really understanding the importance of birth family and friends and everybody else who's in that child's life to help them through that process, rather than what we seem to do at the minute, which is make children choose between the old life that they had and the new life, and not being able to see them together. And I think if we actually all worked together as adopters and birth parents and practitioners together to support that child through that process, then hopefully we'll stop seeing as many adults who've been adopted talking about how traumatic the process was for them. And contact. And I hate that word contact. I stumble over it every time because it sounds like something out of a science fiction movie. It's family time. And I think, you know, as everybody has said, it's about ensuring that the form of contact should fit that child, and everybody else, whether they find that difficult or not, needs to be able to adjust to that. And we need to be allowing the child to make more decisions and to have a much greater voice in how the process is happening to them, rather than just doing things to them and expecting them to be able to adjust. And I think as well, you know, we need to be looking more into digital contact and enabling, you know, my child doesn't communicate with words when she sends me a message. She communicates with emojis, but I still get what she's saying and we still communicate. And I think we need to really be empowering these children and young adults to own the process themselves and to have some control over actually what's happening to their lives, rather than having a system decide. And as Scott said, you know, having the courage to challenge, I think, is exceptionally important, and ensuring that whatever is happening because it's best for that child, not best for the adults that surround that child.
Hiya, thank you so much. I'm just looking at the time. So we've got lots of questions. So if it's okay with everyone, I'm going to quickly move to the Q&A. And then if we have time at the end, I'm going to do a loop around everyone. Does that work for the panelists? Perfect. So, sorry, let me get the questions up. If you see me skipping between two screens, I'm kind of trying to organize everything. Okay, so I've got a question here. It says, I'm a social worker working in fostering. We provide foster carers with extensive and ongoing training, support, in compassion. Considering they both care for children who have experienced trauma. Oh, sorry, I think I've got half of the question here. Sorry, bear with me 1 second. Okay, let's try again. So this person says, Katie says, I'm a social worker working in fostering. We provide foster carers with extensive and ongoing training, and it seems that adoptive parents get very limited support in comparison. Considering they both care for children who have experienced trauma and loss, why do you think there is such a stark contrast in support available? Would anyone like to answer that question?
As an adoptive parent, I'd love to just have 1 minute on this one, and that is entirely correct. I mean, this is an ongoing thing. In the same way, special guardians, kinship carers, you know, it's a case of once that kind of legality is formed, it's, you know, there's obviously social work visits and stuff, but for potentially special guardians and kinship carers, but with adoption, it's just kind of left, and that's a real issue. You know, I think there is this view from adoptive parents that once that adoption order is granted, that's it. Their family is complete. They can move on. They can do what they like. They don't need any further support. And you know, the majority of parents that I know and speak to and try and support, that is not the case. You know, within a year, 2 years, 3 years, however long it takes, they're eventually going to need that support. It took me to become a foster carer to realize just the levels of support that foster carers get. Now, clearly foster carers are doing it on what's potentially a temporary basis, and you know, that's fine. But adoptive parents generally have to kind of seek out their own training and stuff. And there's an element that says, well, so they should. But there's another side to this as well. You know, there's transitioning to high schools, to, you know, a certain specific events, teenage years, adulthood. You know, that would be really useful stuff that local authorities and regional adoption agencies could cover in terms of being able to support children, not the parents, but the children, because whatever is, you know, whatever training the parents are provided with can eventually support the children in terms of that. So that's just my opinion on it. And I've rushed that response, so apologies.
Thank you so much, Scott. So I'm going to go to another question. This one is from Peter. Peter says, I'm a late discovery adoptee, discovering my adoption at 59 via ancestry DNA. I am an adoptee rights advocate, current president of Adoptee Rights Australia. I'm also a long-term foster carer. Changing the narrative is a worldwide goal. We believe that trigger warnings should be displayed whenever adoption is mentioned in the media. This costs the adoption community nothing, but connects adoption to trauma in a non-adoptive community eyes, and hopefully will change the narrative over time. In Australia, trigger warnings are very, very common with any stories associated with Australian associated with Australian Aboriginal peoples, which has helped recognise trauma. What do the panel think is a possible step towards changing the narrative? Who would like to answer this one?
I'm happy to come in there, Shania. I think the issue around trigger warnings is huge, and we know it's something that I raise and other birth parents raise. We have things like National Adoption Week, which is just for anybody who's been through adoption and suffered any kind of trauma through adoption. National Adoption Week is just, it's awful. It's in your face, and it's very, especially from a birth parent's perspective, our voice just doesn't figure into that at all. You know, we see posters, we see adverts for adoption, and it is extremely triggering and traumatizing for anyone who's been through adoption, even those who've had a really happy and a positive experience. It is, again, a reminder of a process that happened that itself was traumatic. And I think that we really do need to start seeing that as a trauma and not this happily ever after, and therefore it doesn't matter if we advertise it. So yeah, I really would like to see trigger warnings on television programs, anything, because I can get halfway through a television series and then all of a sudden there's an adoption story in it, and I have to then sort of weigh up the pros of how much am I enjoying this program. I'm prepared to put myself through that, and more often than not I have to just stop watching because it's too traumatizing. So I think that's a very valid point.
Thank you so much for sharing, Angela. Thank you everyone for sending in the questions. I'm going to do one last question, and then I'm going to go to Tracy, because I know she wants to talk a little bit about the You Can Adopt campaign. So Tom asks, if the panelists could design an alternative to the current care system with no resource constraints, what would that look like? It's a great question.
I'd happily comment on that. I think that it would look something a lot like kinship care, and exploring how the networks, the wider networks of the individual child and their family could be better supported for the long term. And I think some of the advantages of that for children who are from Black communities, the links are easier to achieve. I think that child having some contact with their initial birth family, birth network, in my experience, has been a positive. But as I said in one of my earlier responses, really good kinship care is not cheap. And I also think that there has to be a way of the kinds of people who will go through the process. I mean, I've assessed people for adoption. I wouldn't have somebody crawling over my life in the way that social workers crawl all over prospective adopters' lives. I just wouldn't do it. Some of the questions that people are expected to respond to, I just think, you know, it's none of your business. I'm not going to have this conversation with you. I think that, but those people who are willing to put themselves forward as a carers to non-biological children, I think there has to be a way that is that takes the best parts of adoption and the best parts of kinship and creates something that meets the child's need, and also does not negate who they are and where they've come from. There has to be a way of doing that, but I suspect it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be cheap. I'm a stepfather. I know that the relationship I have with my girls, they're my girls. My birth girl is my girl, my stepkids are my girl. But I understand that they have got other things and other connections elsewhere that are not part of my DNA. And I think we've got to be open enough that we can have a system that works for the child and the networks. And I think really interestingly, the conversation about risk really feeds into this, because I think whenever social work, and this is not a social worker bleating, but social work operates in a really challenging space in terms of decision, particularly in regard to children. And whenever we have an immature press and media who seek for sound bites and seek for sensationalism and don't tell the true story, we're always going to have a challenge about people being risk averse rather than managing risks that sometimes are present in people who make poor choices. So I think there's lots of elements to what a good service would look like, where resources were an issue. But I think the motivation around maintaining those good links ought to be the foundation for some of that.
Thank you so much, David, for your thoughts on that. Tracy, if we can go to you. I know you wanted to talk a bit, and then if we've got time afterwards, we're going to do some more questions.
Yeah. And I think, we've other panelists has mentioned that, there are those situations where adoption may be the best interest of a child, but it's about the type of adopters that is being recruited. It's about their understanding. And I think, the more that these kind of really open, honest debates by the people where adoption has been affected or is affected by, the more prospective adoptive parents can get a real understanding of what it entails to be an adoptive parent. And I think so, Shania and Annalisa, this is, a really useful platform. And I think people we've all got responsibility, every single one of us, to ensure that this conversation continues in every domain forum that we can, because, I think gradually, hopefully, should I say, within the next 2, 3, 4 years, adoption is going to look very, very different. And I think some of that is we're being forced into having to consider adoption and looking at adoption from a different lens, because a lot of our children and young people are initiating those contacts with their birth family outside of any form of structure because of social media. And when it does happen, and then we become involved, there's been, so many occasions where it just works. So I think, there is still a need for adoptive families. There is a high percentage of Black and mixed heritage children who requires family. And the more that we can have these conversations, the more that people are having an understanding of what loss means. If you're adopting, you have a genuine love to try and help a child living within an environment where they're going to be cared for, where all their needs are going to be met, primarily their identity needs, because that has a significant impact, as we all discussed, in the long term, not just the here and now and when they're children, but later on, the impact of the loss with regards to attachments in their adult years, with regards to, just the normality of having an intimate relationship, the fear of rejection, the fear of experiencing loss again, often prevents them from engaging in those relationships because they can't bear that pain. So, these conversations really does need to be undertaken in order for us to prepare, prospective adopters very, very differently, and having that voice. So at the moment, the regulations and legislation regarding adoption has changed, whereas, now it's a 6-month process. And as I said, there is a need. And for anybody who is interested in, and especially those on this platform, because, you've just got an insight into people's experiences and the impact long-term, short-term, and in the future. For you are the kind of people that, you know, that is needed. Those that are coming in with a real good understanding. And I would, you know, I'd urge you to, you know, make contact with your local authorities to explore this, but also, you know, just having that confidence to be challenging social workers who are engaging in those assessments, because ultimately, regardless of what a social worker suggests or recommends for contact, ultimately the decision is yours. You know, the local authority has no parental responsibilities or control over contact with the family. So it's about really being clued up and having a good knowledge of, you know, your rights as adoptive parents, and being able to push that. So yeah, it's just, you know, a plug for more informed prospective adopters in order to be able to change the dynamics of adoption.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Okay, we're going to do one last quick question. I have a question from Dion. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. So Dion says, I am a transracial adoptee creative. My musical, DAWTA, speaks about this conversation about Sarah, her birth mother, and her adoptive parent. I have toured in 2019 to 2020 and met adoptees across the country, and globally, but we are fragmented in our efforts. How can we all come together to improve adoption together? And Dion has also got a link to their website. So I'm not sure if you've put it in the chat, but they're going to put that in the chat. So make sure you go and check out their musical, because I've heard that it's amazing. But the question is, how can we come together to improve adoption together? If someone could really briefly answer the question, who would like to go? Okay, so we've got Dawn and Pam. If you could both very briefly answer the question. We'll go to Pam first and then Dawn.
Yes, I think the participants in adoption, the adoptees, the adoptive parents and birth parents, are more than willing to work together very constructively and to work with professionals constructively. But they alone cannot come up with the forum within which that will happen. There needs to be funding. The government are carrying out a care review. The people they should be listening to are these participants in adoption, and they should be bringing them together and giving extensive attention to what they have to say, and to facilitate the establishment of networks which in the long term will benefit that community and will benefit the service, and probably result in less need for statutory input. But while you starve the voluntary and self-help support side of the resources they need, they will just fragment, and then you don't get the full picture.
Thank you so much, Pam. Dawn, can we go to you?
Yeah, I would echo a lot of what Pam's saying, but just that we listen to each other. We all have something to learn from someone else in the adoption experience. So to work together to make it better, we have to sit down and listen, not just say what we want to say and switch off when we hear something else. I think it needs to be an ongoing conversation, and that's the only way these reforms are going to be made and these changes are going to happen. I think too often there are conversations that are one-sided and things aren't actually heard. It's just said for the sake of being said. So I would say listening, actually going out and listening to people would be my answer.
Thank you, that's amazing. I'm so sorry if we didn't get to your question, and I'm so sorry to the panelists because we had so much more to say, but we've got 5 minutes left, so I'm gonna finish off on a reading, and then we'll wrap up. So I'd like to read you guys something about my story. April 1999. I don't know what she went through that got her to this point, but it must have been terrible. I don't understand it, but I accept it. I don't understand. She was addicted to drugs, heroin. I'm not sure how long for, but long enough to make her forget that getting pregnant was possible. And it was extremely possible. I am proof of that. She didn't want me. She had 2 children before me. She wanted them, but she didn't want me. While she was pregnant, she tried to get rid of me twice. She didn't want me, but she accepted me. Ironic as the roles are now reversed. We were one. I was her and she was me. I guess that never changed. One thing we had in common was the heroin, circulating through both of our bodies. Maybe this was the only thing that could get her through carrying a child she didn't want for 9 months. November 1999, I was born. I was born. When I go about my everyday life, I tend to forget that just being born was a massive achievement. She tried to get rid of me twice, but I was born. She couldn't look after me. They told her they found a family that could. She grew me, so she's my mum. She birthed me, so she's my mum. She damaged me, is she my mum? She feels like my mum, she smells like my mum, so she's my mum. A mother and her child form a connection so strong that even a tiny baby knows when it's not with its mother. My new mum and dad took me home. They fed me, they clothed me, they loved me. They washed me, they nursed me back to health, they loved me. They are my parents, I was safe. But birth mum was getting better, and everyone says a child should be with its parents. So back I went. I was passed from my mum to my mum, and even as a baby, I didn't understand, but I understood. March 2004, I was adopted. My birth mum couldn't look after me, but my mum and dad chose to dedicate their life to a happy, confused, difficult child. So I grew, and I messed up again and again. I was so happy, but so unhappy, and I didn't know why. People constantly told me that I should be grateful. I was given a second chance. I should be grateful. I am grateful. So why was I so lost? But I ask you, if you had a book, a beautiful book with a beautiful story, but the first 30 pages were torn out, burnt, and never to be seen again, would you understand the story? Well, you've got the last 270 pages. You should be grateful. You should understand the story. You might try to imagine what the first 30 pages were like, but the first few pages are the backstory. Who is the main character? Where do they come from? What is their culture? Who are they? And what made them that way? There'd be no way of knowing. So you might give up and read another book. I am that book. However, I can't just give up and get another life. I spent my life searching for those first 30 pages, but I'll never get them back. So I turned around, I bought a new book, and I started writing. I created my own pages. Thank you. So we've got 1 minute left. So I'd just like to thank Festival of Debate for allowing us to have this discussion. I'd like to say a massive thank you to all of the panelists for sharing so bravely. And Adoptee Futures has just launched, we've just launched our website. So be sure to check it out. It's www.adopteefutures.org. Again, thank you so much to the panelists for sharing. I wish that we had more time to discuss. Annalisa has just put the link to our website in the chat. But yeah, I'm not sure if you want to say anything, Annalisa, or if any of the...
I didn't, but I will. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. This has been so incredible and really powerful. And I'm really excited to see what we do next, to be honest, and carry on these conversations. And really just make sure that the voices of adoptees are out there and centered. We will be doing more events, so please sign up to our mailing list on our website. Please tweet us, follow us, like get us out there, And if you are working in fostering and adoption, then invite us to come do workshops and public speaking events as well. So thank you to all our panelists. Massive thank you to Joe and Flick from Festival of Debate and everybody at Festival of Debate who has organised this event. Please, please, please go on their website, check out their rest of the programme. They do absolutely amazing work. So I highly recommend them and Opus Independence. And yeah, that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.